Today, we are examining one of Britain's most intriguing Second World War prototype aircraft. Sadly, it never received service even with rather good performance records. This resulted from a combination of bad preparation and timing, most importantly, from bad luck. We are without a doubt discussing the Martin Baker MB.5. James Martin came up with this amazing aircraft, originally starting the company in 1934. He and Captain Valentine Baker's first aircraft, a light touring variant known as the MB.1, would set the stage for a long run of prototypes far into the 1940s. The most well-known of the Martin Baker's fighter aircraft came from an Air Ministry specification calling for a replacement for the Hurricane and the Spitfire, a tough request indeed. Designed to satisfy Air Ministry specification F-13-39, the MB.5 tale really starts with the MB.3. With war hanging on the horizon, there was an urgent need for a high-speed single-seat fighter that could operate anywhere, regardless of climate. No matter the elevation, the specification demanded a top speed of no less than 400 miles an hour and 15,000 feet, and highly recommended the adoption of a two-stage supercharger to maximize the engine performance. The armaments were intended to be either a pair of 20mm cannons or 8 .303 caliber machine guns. This new fighter was supposed to use these weapons for either possible escort duty or home defense. With an additional 30% fuel load retained in reserve, the specification called for a quite high endurance, 2 hours of cruising time, plus an extra 30 minutes at maximum power to cover both takeoff and combat time. Given the Spitfire's performance was regarded as the benchmark for minimal standards, this was a lot to demand of any manufacturer in 1939. But Martin Baker succeeded in this task. Originally aimed at developing an airplane fitting this criteria, the MB.3 was on paper a very attractive design. First, it was to be furnished with 6 20mm Hispano cannons, each carrying 200 rounds apiece. Martin Baker expected a top speed in excess of 410 miles an hour at 15,000 feet using the freshly built Rolls-Royce Griffin as the planned power plant. The MB.3 had also been made to be as simple as repair and servicing could allow. Unlike the RAF's present line of aircraft, most of the paneling could be readily removed, so the entire thing could be broken down for simple transportation. 3 prototype aircraft were ordered as the MB.3. Once the design satisfied ministry standards, a contract was inked. The initial prototype's delivery date was supposed to be the end of the year, optimistically. As it happened though, the MB.3 would not be finished until much later. There were 3 causes behind this. First, it became quite clear that the Rolls-Royce Griffin would not be ready for usage in time, so another solution had to be discovered. Second, Martin Baker was not a particularly big business, therefore creating a full prototype in 6 months was a big challenge. Thirdly, Britain was at war by the year's end, therefore Martin Baker's swift swapping with other production orders became the priority. All of this meant that the MB.3 was still unfinished by mid-1941, and the business was subsequently advised that production orders were not needed. They opted to complete the prototype nevertheless, since they were close to finishing anyway. By now, it possessed the 36-litre 2020 horsepower Napier Sabre, the same H-24 engine running the Hawker Typhoon and the Hawker Tempest. It would not have the same chin-mounted radiator that made those aircraft so identifiable. Martin sought all the speed he could muster and reduced drag by removing the coolant and oil radiators to the underside of the wings. So, putting the coolant system in this manner most definitely improved the lines of the aircraft. But the Sabre engine kept running across overheating issues during tests, and this would finally have deadly results. On August 31st, 1942, Valentine Baker was at controls as the prototype took off for the first flight. He reached top speed of 415 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, flying with ballast to replicate the weight of guns and ammo instantly proved its worth. The trials for the MB.3 would last August through September, but then disaster would strike. Valentine Baker had just lifted off on September 12th when the Napier Sabre engine failed from a fractured sleeve drive crank. Baker tried an emergency landing, descending his aircraft in a field outside the runway. But he struck a tree stump or hay bale, sources vary on this, and perished. The aircraft caught fire. This incident effectively halted the MB.3 projects in its tracks, and Martin Baker was now lacking one of its original founders. Martin, who'd been Baker's greatest friend since the company's founding, is said to have suffered greatly upon finding out about the tragedy. Consequently, the company's course would be changed noticeably in the next few years. Martin was still committed, though, to create a great fighter and carry on the work he and Baker had begun. He thus started on a redesign of their MB.3, using a Rolls-Royce Griffin to make several improvements, re-engineering it, and the resultant aircraft would become the MB.5. Although there were clearly numerous differences, design and construction were in some respects quite comparable to that of the MB.3. The aircraft kept the MB.3's ease of construction quite similar. The ground crew could simply replace aluminium panels which served as the airframe skin, and remove them during maintenance. This would be a strong aspect of the aeroplane since it enabled really high degrees of flexibility and repairability if necessary. Though internally there were actually numerous changes. The instantly identifiable clipped short wings of the airframe also continued on for their predecessor. From the MB.3, the armaments were really decreased. From 6, it would now feature 4 20mm Hispano Mach II cannons. The ammo load would remain the same, but the total would be 800, with 200 rounds each gun. Apart from the rudder, which was skinned in fabric, most of the systems would now be run pneumatically, including the undercarriage brakes and split trailing edge flaps. The control surfaces were totally coated in metal. Of course, the nose shows the most alteration. That much was known. A re-engine was required. Designs were developed. The Bristol Centaurus was momentarily under consideration. This radial-powered aircraft would be known as the MB.4, but it only existed on paper. Rather, as was already established, the preferred power source would be the formidable Rolls-Royce Griffin. The MB.5 was mostly based on Martin Baker's earlier series of aircraft, which predates the P-51 by years and has a quite different fuselage and wing construction design to the P-51. It's most likely a case of convergent evolution. 2 high-performance aircraft built with strong inline engines and high speeds at comparable times, producing identical design decisions. Dimension-wise, the MB.5 was somewhat big for an aircraft of its type, at least in the United Kingdom, with a wingspan of 35 feet and a length and height of 37 foot. This made it much longer than the Spitfire. It was meant to replace and be more like the bigger single-engined fighters fought by the United States, hence fueling the rumors that part of its design was taken from the P-51. This made the MB.5 quite hefty, weighing in at 9,233 pounds empty and 11,500 pounds when fully loaded. Though the process would be very slow due to other obligations, the corporation had been tied to construction of the aircraft would start in 1943. The Second World War was still underway, and regrettably for the Air Ministry, Mr. James Martin was reportedly a perfectionist with this design. He regularly held back the prototype, making last-minute changes and experimenting with it as he proceeded. Eventually, this tinkering would enable the aircraft to reach maximum performance before the initial flying tests. But, as Captain Baker had been the only test pilot for the company, an outside pilot had to be brought in for the test flights of the MB.5. This was Brian Grinstead, loaned from Rottol, another British aviation company that specialised in propellers. Sadly, this may have also been a contributing factor to the final decision not to pursue with additional development later on. Given the serial number R2496, the finished prototype would be disassembled and delivered to the testing grounds at RAF Harwell on May 23, 1944. Immediately, the ability to disassemble, transport and reassemble and fly a sophisticated fighter aircraft in less than a day says eloquently about the intelligent engineering that had gone into the MB.5's design, let alone the fact that apparently assembling it took just 1 hour. Sadly though, for the prototype, it would not be entirely positive news. Actually, Grinstead would be somewhat critical of the MB.5 upon completing the first flight, mostly pointing out some clear directional instability. Based mostly on careful analysis of Grinstead's detailed flight report, it was found that the large contour rotating propellers reduced the authority of the rudder, which had remained virtually unchanged from the MB.3. Martin, however, was not discouraged and got to work drawing up some changes to remedy the aircraft's shortcomings. Testing different rudder sizes took almost 6 months to finish, but once Grinstead flew the MB.5 once again, the handling had much improved. With a top speed of 395 miles an hour at sea level, which grew to 425 miles at 6,000 feet, and ultimately up to 459 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, the aircraft received great performance marks. It ascended fairly rapidly as well. In 6.5 minutes, the MB.5 could reach 20,000 feet, nearly on par with similar late war propeller-driven aircraft. Though, conversely, this also gave improved acceleration in dives, which allowed it to reach extremely high speeds by which all accounts had excelled. The acceleration was regarded as one of the few shortcomings, along with some residual directional instability due to the high weight of the aircraft. With 2 tanks in front and behind the pilot, giving a range of up to 1,120 miles from the 750-litre fuel capacity, range and endurance was also well rated. Comparatively to the Spitfire's narrow-track undercarriage, the spaced-out design of the undercarriage, like that on the MB.3, gave a much safer and robust landing performance to the MB.5. The contra-rotating propellers negated the problems caused by engine torque. Had the aircraft entered service perhaps 2 years earlier, to actually be useful, this enhanced control on the ground and in the air would have made the MB.5 easier for inexperienced pilots to learn. Unlike on a conventional single-propeller fighter, the aircraft wasn't pulled by torque to one side. The Air Ministry told Martin in the last months of 1944, with barely 40 hours of flight time recorded on the MB.5, that they would not be pursuing further research or placing any production orders for the aircraft. Sadly, this was a supply and demand situation. The RAF did not particularly need a fresh generation of fighter designs as the war in Europe was drawing to an end. When they did, it was clear that the new generation would comprise jet-powered aircraft. Some were indeed under development already, and thus, the MB.5 was now reduced to a life of testing and public displays. Among these, the MB.5 would participate in a demonstration in front of Winston Churchill at Farnborough in 1945, but their unfortunate timing would cause engine failure mid-flight. After this near miss, it was flown by a range of test pilots and operated significantly more conservatively over the next 18 months, accruing just a further 40 hours of flying time. Though little utilized during this period and in the years that followed, everyone who had the opportunity to fly it gave almost perfect compliments. The aircraft would return to Farnborough in June 1946 and participate in an aerobatic display under the direction of Polish squadron leader Jan Zurakowski, who declared that the MB.5 was the best he had ever flown. Wing Commander Morris A. Smith would fly the MB.5 under further testing in 1947 from de Havilland at Hatfield, then once more back to Ray Farnborough. At Farnborough, the aircraft would then be piloted by renowned test pilot captain Eric Winkle Brown, known for his wartime service and illustrious career. Brown would reflect the views of his contemporaries, praising the aircraft's remarkable top speed and handling, and stating, in light of the fact that it made its maiden flight as early as the 23rd of May 1944, he did mention that the aircraft's biggest vice was still its directional instability, a trait which apparently the enlarged vertical stabilizers had not totally fixed. At this period, the MB.5 was in its autumn years. It would be moved to the Air Ministry's Servicing Development Unit at RAF Watersham for the next 2 years of its life, mostly used as a training and testing airframe until 1950, then moved to RAF Birkeneuter, where the much-loved but sad MB.5, now a 6-year-old airframe, would meet its ultimate death. Until 1963, it was utilized as a ground target for training drills. Thereafter, what remained burnt. It was a careless and unfair end for such a historical significant aircraft, one that ought most likely to have been kept and shown in a museum. Sadly, this also means that now we only have a replica made in Nevada, United States, currently constructed 2 meters shorter than the original. This made use of P-51's Mustang wings. At least after the MB.5 had entered service, they would have been among the fastest combat aircraft available worldwide for the period. Regretfully though, it was not to be. Simply too late to generate attention, and 8 years on, we can only hypothesize on what may have been if it had been erected somewhat faster. Found in December 2020, Captain Valentine Baker's crash site is situated at Aylesbury Vale Golf Club. Along with a bust of Valentine Baker, a tribute to him was built there and is now open to the public. Additionally, a memorial at RAF Wing close to the hangar where the MB.3 was first kept. After a few more ventures into aircraft design, the post-war jet-powered MB.6 and 7, Martin Baker as a company would produce no more, and Martin personally, as a result of Baker's death, would reorganize and dedicate his company and the rest of his life to the design and production of aircraft ejection systems to save pilots' lives, which is what the company is famous and still successful till today.